Welcome. Glad to have you guys with us today. Our online lecture today is about the United States and its conflict with its neighbor to the south, Mexico. Just a little bit before we start, you'll notice the graphic organizer is kind of a curvy formation, and there are circles, and then it changes over to rectangles. The reason it's set up like this is because the war with Mexico happened over a pretty long time, about 12 years, and it was fought in two different phases. So the circles or ovals represent phase one, and then the squares represent phase number two, just to kind of help you guys stay organized. Your job today is to fill in the blanks as we go through each of the steps. A little bit before we start, though, this is what our country looked like in 1836. We got about 25, 26 states. We are getting pretty big, but this huge amount of land over here is not yet part of the United States. And the biggest chunk of this land belongs to Mexico. So the main reason we fight a war with Mexico is over land. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. Okay, we're in our first stop. What caused the war with Mexico? And it basically starts with Mexico is recruiting American citizens. And the reason they want Americans is because they have a lot of land, but not a lot of people, especially in a part of Mexico known as Mexican Texas. So they are recruiting Americans, pioneers, to move from the United States to Mexico. And it started out as a good idea, but then we're going to see it turns bad. In 1836, Americans living in Texas kind of decide that they don't want to be a part of Mexico any longer, and they stage a revolt. They basically rise up and declare their independence. And Texas, which is now full of Americans, says to Mexico, we're going to be independent and we're going to start our own country. And they name it the Lone Star Republic. That's why when you look at Texas's flag today, it still has the single Lone Star, and they're nicknamed the Lone Star State. So Texas basically says, okay, we are now our own country. As you might imagine, Mexico does not really like this too much, so they send in the army, and the first big fighting takes place at an old church called the Alamo, and the Americans barricade themselves inside, refuse to come out. Mexico attacks, and after a 3-day siege, approximately 185 Americans are killed at the Battle of the Alamo. This is kind of like the trigger point that really starts the war, really gets things going. The Americans lose the first battle of the Alamo, but it inspires a lot of other Americans to come fight in the war. After a couple years, the Americans defeat Mexico, and Texas wins its independence. Mexico is forced to cede Texas and give it away. For a while, Texas becomes its own country, the Lone Star Republic, but then Texas realizes that it would be much better off if it actually joined the United States, and Texas is admitted as the 28th state in the United States. That kind of concludes the first phase of the war. So the beginning of the war is all about Texas and how the United States adds Texas to its country. That takes us into the second phase of the war. And the second phase is a lot like the first phase, except now what we have is not Americans in Texas, but Americans living in California. California is kind of the trigger point of the second phase of the war. And California sees the success that Texas had and how Texas broke away. And Americans living in California, remember because of the gold rush, the 49ers they decide that they want to break away and do the same thing and start their own republic. When they break away from Mexico, they call themselves the California Republic, and on their flag is a bear. So sometimes we call this event the Bear Flag Revolt. But it's basically the same thing. California no longer wants to be part of Mexico. What happens is Mexico this time says enough is enough. This just happened to us in Texas. Now it's happening again in California. We got to put a stop to these greedy Americans trying to take all of our land. So Mexico basically declares war on the United States. And the United States, not to be outdone, says, okay, fine, we're going to declare war on you. And that starts the second phase of the war, which is kind of the bigger, more intense phase of the war. Once the fighting starts, the United States puts its forces under the command of General Winfield Scott. He was our #1 commander, and he decides that the best thing to do is just to invade Mexico and go after their capital city. So after a few battles, General Scott enters Mexico City and takes over the capital with a big kind of dramatic victory. Mexico realizes that the United States, because of industrialization, they have so many weapons, they have so many supplies, they just can't compete with all of the modern weapons and technology of the Americans. So Mexico realizes that they basically have to surrender and end up losing the war, which is bad for Mexico, but of course good for the United States. The biggest effect of the war with Mexico after this fighting ends is Mexico is basically forced to sign a treaty called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And this treaty is where they have to cede, have to give away about half of Mexico to the United States. This big, huge chunk of land where we get states of California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, even really parts of Colorado, this whole big part of the country we call today the Southwest was part of the Mexican cession. And this is all land that we took from Mexico by fighting the Mexican-American War. That concludes our lecture. I do need you guys to do 2 more things. I want you to think about the painting of Manifest Destiny, and I want you to use the definition of Manifest Destiny and answer the question: how could we use this belief in Manifest Destiny to justify the war? How can we say that what we did is okay based on this idea of Manifest Destiny? Give me a sentence or 2 explaining that. And then the very last thing I need you guys to do is write me a haiku. Remember that February is National Haiku Month. So the title of your haiku is War with Mexico. And then a short little poem, 5 syllables in the first line, 7 syllables in the second line, and 5 syllables in the third line. Ran just about at 9 minutes, so hopefully you guys got all this down. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see you back in class.